This morning, the President of the United States posted to Truth Social the vulgar post I'm sure you have seen by now with an F-bomb and a quote, "Praise be to Allah." Now compare that to another president who led America through a war, Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural, ending with these words, "With malice towards none, with charity for all." It's quite a stark difference, which brings us to a part of the Constitution most Americans have never had reason to think about. Section 4 of the 25th Amendment, which says if the vice president and a majority of the cabinet decide the president is unable to do the job, they can notify Congress and the vice president takes over as acting president immediately. It has never been used in American history before, and it's an extremely high bar to get there. But this morning, Democratic Senator Chris Murphy posted this online, quote, "If I were in Trump's cabinet, I would spend Easter calling constitutional lawyers about the 25th Amendment." And our next guest writes this, quote, "I wonder very much what the next few days will bring, because this is looking like basically a president who is losing it."
What's happening, friends? John here. So this is happening right now. Senator Chris Murphy has invoked the 25th Amendment, arguing Trump's pledge to eradicate an entire civilization signals he is unfit to serve, not through impeachment, but through the constitutional mechanism allowing the VP and cabinet to remove him. The move shifts the battlefield from Congress to the executive branch itself, raising the most urgent question: who decides when a president is no longer in control of his senses? Think about the sheer audacity of what Murphy is suggesting here. He's not saying Trump did something wrong in the past that deserves punishment. He's saying Trump's current mental state, as evidenced by a single social media post threatening to eradicate an entire civilization, makes him an ongoing danger to the country and the world. The post in question, the civilization will die tonight statement,
and unfortunately losing it in a way that can really make the world a much worse place very fast. Joining us now is Paul Krugman, a Nobel laureate, research professor of economics at CUNY's Graduate Center and author of the Paul Krugman Substack. Paul, it's great to have you on the show. Thank you for making time for us. Give us the explanation behind how you got to that conclusion and made that point about what is going to happen in the next few days and why it could be so dangerous, not just for America, but for the world.
Okay, first thing to say is that these two posts and some other things that Trump has said in interviews and in the last few days, they are completely unhinged. Before we get into his mental state, let's just say that he is now threatening violence against innocent civilians because he's unable to get what he wants militarily. And we have a name for people who use violence against innocent people because because they're too weak to get what they want militarily. We call them terrorists.
Isn't evidence of a crime. It's evidence of unfitness. Evidence that the president who controls the most powerful military in human history may not be in control of his own faculties. And the constitutional mechanism that addresses that specific problem isn't impeachment, which requires investigation, hearings, votes, and a Senate trial that would take months. It's Section 4 of the 25th Amendment, which can transfer power immediately upon delivery of a declaration from the Vice President and a majority of the Cabinet. No floor vote needed, no committee markup, no two-thirds threshold, just the judgment of the people closest to the President that he can no longer discharge his duties. Representative Ro Khanna was even more direct in his assessment of the situation.
So, I've been looking at the definitions, ICE's definition of terrorism, and what the President of the United States has been saying the past couple of days really fits the definition of terrorism as his own officials write it down. So this is horrifying. And the reason I'm saying 25th Amendment and all that is the instability. I mean, just a few days ago, he was saying, we've won and we don't need to open the Strait of Hormuz. That's up to other people. And now, just a couple of days later, he's saying, wow, we're going to destroy Iran's power plants and its bridges. We're going to bond them back into the Stone Ages. He's using turns of phrase that are very unlike him. I mean, the first post said, "Glory be to God." The second one concluded, "Allah Akbar." This doesn't either he's having major personality disorder or somebody else is largely writing it. So this is really horrifying, and this is
cutting through the legal jargon and constitutional niceties to make a devastatingly simple argument. Threatening war crimes is a clear breach of our Constitution and the Geneva Conventions, he said. And then he dropped the hammer. We invoke the 25th and remove. Not we file articles of impeachment. Not we seek conviction in the Senate. Not we wait for the courts to sort this out. We invoke the 25th and remove. The urgency of that formulation can't be overstated because Khanna understood something that many observers missed in the chaos of the moment. The 25th Amendment mechanism.
To have somebody who is that unhinged and unstable in control of the armed forces of the United States is a really horrifying thing.
Paul, you mentioned Tim Snyder's argument that much of this could be a pretext for something else. Why do you believe that?
Yeah, Tim Snyder. Now, I'm reluctant to go there, but Trump has ordered this, called for in his budget, not ordered. He can't do that, we don't think, an enormous increase in military spending for no clear purpose, but it's something that will make Army officers happy. And there's this, what we're seeing is a lot of, we're seeing the Pete Hegseth, the self-proclaimed Secretary of War, firing senior officers in the middle of a war, and seemingly what sure looks like loyalty tests being imposed within the military, personal loyalty tests. It's not too hard to think that something is going to, that there's certainly some intention to try to somehow circumvent or at least rig
is the only available constitutional removal process that doesn't require the legislative calendar, that can operate at any hour of any day, that doesn't require the House to be in session or the Senate to be convened. If the Vice President and the Cabinet act, the transfer of power is immediate. No waiting, no debating, no procedural delays that could allow a president who might be dangerous to continue wielding the nuclear codes and commanding the armed forces. This is why the phrase "before midnight" became so charged with constitutional significance in the hours following the civilization post. The deadline Trump had set for Iran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz was approaching. The military threat was live. American forces were potentially hours away from engaging in operations that could have killed hundreds of thousands of people and plunged the entire Middle East into chaos.
The midterm elections. Now, I don't know that. I mean, what we can see right off is that this guy, that I wouldn't trust someone who raves on social media the way the President of the United States does. I wouldn't trust him to run the bodega around the corner. I wouldn't trust him to watch my cat. And to have him watching the military of the United States is just, this should not be allowed to persist. If we had a functioning democracy, he would be out one way or another. But, yesterday.
Paul, you said you don't trust him to run the bodega or watch your cat. He also has quite a bit of influence over the global economy as well as lots of munitions. I'm wondering what you make of this term that I've been hearing a lot recently, the polycrisis, the idea that we might have a few different economic, maybe time bombs is the wrong word, given that there's an actual war going on, but basically metaphorical time bombs about to go off because you have the war, you have the AI boom / bubble propping up much of the economy. Who knows how sustainable that is. And you also have some potential trouble in a corner of the financial market called private credit.
The impeachment track would have taken weeks at minimum, months more likely, and in the meantime, the president would retain full command authority over the military. The 25th Amendment track could have operated on a timeline compatible with the crisis if only the vice president and the cabinet had been willing to act. But J.D. Vance was not going to transmit a declaration against the president who selected him as running mate, the man to whom he has been one of the most consistently loyal political allies in the entire Trump orbit. And without Vance, the cabinet majority required for Section 4 cannot be achieved regardless of how many members of Congress demand it. The cabinet itself was never going to produce a majority declaration against the president who appointed them, people who owe their positions to Trump and whose political futures depend on his continued favor. This is the specific constitutional predicament that Murphy and Khanna and others were articulating from different angles on the night of the civilization post. The most urgent crisis of the second term produces the clearest available case for immediate removal through the fastest available constitutional mechanism, and the fastest available constitutional mechanism requires the institutional willingness of the Vice President and the Cabinet, a willingness that is simply not available in the current political configuration. The gap between the urgency the situation demands and the institutional availability of the mechanisms that could address it is the specific tragedy of the moment, the constitutional trap that the founders could never have anticipated when they designed a system that assumed good faith and institutional courage from the people closest to the president. Representative Seth Moulton, a former Marine who served in Iraq and whose military background gives his assessment of war crimes and emergency dimensions specific institutional credibility, offered what might be the most complete single-sentence expression of the dual-track strategy that the pro-removal forces were deploying. Trump has committed an impeachable offense, Moulton said, and Congress must return and oust him before he inflicts further harm. That single sentence captures both the backward-looking accountability argument and the forward-looking urgency argument in a way that no other statement quite manages. He committed an impeachable offense, that's the high crimes and misdemeanors claim, grounded in the specific conduct of the civilization post and the unauthorized war powers violations and the potential Geneva Convention's breaches. Before he inflicts further harm, that's the forward-looking urgency claim that gives the before midnight language its constitutional content grounded in the specific assessment that a president who made the civilization post is capable of inflicting further harm in the hours remaining before the Iran deadline expires. Moulton's dual-track formulation is the constitutional bridge between the impeachment track and the 25th Amendment track, the simultaneous deployment of both mechanisms in response to the same precipitating event on the same night that the ceasefire was announced just 90 minutes before the deadline. His military background adds a layer of credibility to the urgency argument that a civilian member's forward-looking assessment wouldn't carry in the same way, because Moulton understands what military operations against Iranian civilian infrastructure would actually involve, knows the scale of destruction that could be unleashed, and has the institutional knowledge to assess the risk of further harm in a way that someone who's never served couldn't match. When he says oust him before he inflicts further harm, he's not speaking abstractly or hypothetically. He's speaking from the experience of someone who understands war, who knows what happens when the most powerful military in the world is unleashed against a population, and who has seen firsthand the kind of civilian devastation that can result when military force is employed without clear strategic objectives and proper legal authorization. The convergence of these three statements from Murphy, Khanna, and Moulton, combined with the same night reconvening demand from Senator Ed Markey and the institutional validation from former Speaker Nancy Pelosi joining the removal demands, constitutes the most complete expression of the dual-track constitutional strategy that Representative Jamie Raskin's briefings had been preparing the Democratic caucus for. The simultaneous deployment of impeachment as the formal accountability mechanism and Section 4 as the emergency removal mechanism reflects a sophisticated legal strategy that understands the different timelines, different institutional actors, and different constitutional standards that each mechanism requires. It's not about picking one approach or the other. It's about using every available tool simultaneously to create maximum constitutional pressure from two directions: the backward-looking accountability that establishes the grounds for removal and the forward-looking urgency that demands immediate action. Pelosi's joining the demands deserves special attention because of what her institutional identity brings to the accountability picture. Pelosi's role in the first-term impeachment proceedings was to manage the process, to decide when to proceed, when to hold back, how to sequence the accountability actions to maximize their political effectiveness. She is the person who controlled the timing of the first impeachment in 2019 and the second in 2021, the person whose strategic calculation about when the political conditions are right for impeachment has been the most institutionally consequential single judgment in the Democratic caucus's approach to the mechanism. When Pelosi joins the April 7th removal demands, she is not simply adding her voice to a progressive chorus or signaling solidarity with the more aggressive elements of her party. She is making a specific institutional calculation that the specific conduct of the civilization post meets the threshold that her most deliberate available judgment, the judgment of the person who has managed the impeachment mechanism twice and who has spent her career studying the specific political calculations the mechanism requires, concludes is sufficient to warrant demanding removal. The Pelosi signal is the specific validation that the April 7th demands have reached a level of institutional credibility that makes them more than progressive immediatism, more than the kind of emotional response that fades when the immediate crisis passes. They have reached the level of the most strategically deliberate available judgment in the Democratic caucus's accountability apparatus, the judgment of someone who has been around long enough and thought carefully enough to know the difference between political theater and genuine constitutional crisis. When Pelosi says the president must be removed, she is not speaking from the progressive wing's more immediate instincts about accountability. She is speaking from the institutional center that has historically been the most cautious and deliberate force in Democratic politics, the force that has consistently held back the more aggressive elements of the party when it judged the political conditions weren't right for impeachment. Now let's talk about what the mental fitness framing's constitutional significance means for the 25th Amendment track, because this is where the legal argument gets genuinely fascinating and where the distinction between the two removal mechanisms becomes clearest. The Section 4 mechanism's specific constitutional design makes it both the fastest available removal mechanism and the one most directly dependent on the political will of a specific small set of institutional actors. Section 4 requires the Vice President and a majority of the cabinet to transmit the declaration. It requires no congressional vote, no floor schedule, no two-thirds threshold, no debate on the floor of the House. If Vance and a cabinet majority act, the transfer is immediate. The specific political problem with the Section 4 track is not its constitutional mechanics. Those mechanics are the fastest available constitutional design for a removal mechanism that the founders could have imagined. The problem is its institutional actors, people whose political loyalties and personal interests are aligned with the president they would have to declare unfit. Vance was not going to transmit a declaration against the president who selected him as running mate and to whom he has been one of the most consistently loyal political allies. The cabinet was not going to produce a majority declaration against the president who appointed them, people who owe their positions to Trump and whose political futures depend on his continued favor. The mental fitness framing that Murphy articulated, the no president in control of his senses argument, is the specific constitutional argument most directly addressed to the institutional actors that Section 4 requires. It is an appeal to Vance and the cabinet to make the judgment that any reasonable person can make from the civilization post alone, without expert evaluation, without extended deliberation, without the kind of formal impeachment proceeding that a high crime standard would require. Murphy is saying you do not need a psychiatrist to see that no president in control of his senses would pledge to eradicate an entire civilization. You do not need a trial to determine that the standard for Section 4 has been met. You need only to read the post, and if you agree that no president in control of his senses would have made it, you have the Section 4 authority to act. The constitutional elegance of Murphy's argument is its accessibility. You don't need a constitutional law degree to recognize that a president who threatens to eradicate an entire civilization is not in control of his senses. You don't need to be a psychiatrist to see that someone who would make such a threat is not fit to command the most powerful military in human history. You need only to read the post to understand what it says and to recognize that no person in their right mind would say such a thing. And if you do recognize that, the 25th Amendment provides the mechanism to act without the legislative calendar that makes the urgency argument incompatible with the impeachment track. The demand for removal before midnight, the specific urgency that Khanna articulated when he said, "We invoke the 25th and remove," is the constitutional expression of the timeline the crisis demands. This mechanism operates on a timeline compatible with the crisis, unlike impeachment, which requires a weeks-long or months-long legislative process that simply cannot address an emergency that might unfold in hours. The political problem, and it's a devastating one, is that Vance will not act and the cabinet will not act, and no amount of congressional demanding or constitutional reasoning can change that reality. This is the specific constitutional predicament that the before midnight framing makes explicit, the gap between the urgency the situation requires and the institutional willingness the mechanism demands. The members who demanded removal before midnight were not ignorant of this reality. They understood perfectly well that Vance was not going to act, that the cabinet would protect its own positions, that the constitutional mechanism most compatible with the timeline of the crisis was unavailable because the people who control it are politically unwilling to deploy it. But they made the demand anyway, and the demand itself has constitutional significance because it creates a permanent record of what members of Congress concluded on the night of the civilization post, a record that will be available to any future Section 4 proceeding that examines the evidence of presidential unfitness that the second term has produced. Now let's examine the over 200-member historical baseline and what it means for the April 7th demands placed in the documented trajectory. The record of over 200 lawmakers on the record calling for Trump's removal since January 2021 is the specific institutional context that makes the April 7th demands a continuation of a sustained position rather than an episodic outburst. That baseline establishes that the remove Trump position has been held by more than 200 members of Congress across a 4-year-plus period, through the January 2021 post-January 6th crisis, through the first term and second term accusations, through the Iran war and the civilization post and the April 7th demands. This sustained baseline is the documented evidence that the removal sentiment is not responsive primarily to any single episode, but reflects a sustained institutional conviction about the character of the presidency, a conviction that over 200 members have maintained through multiple crises without the political conditions changing enough to produce the formal outcomes the conviction demands. The April 7th demands, with over 85 members demanding removal in less than 24 hours, represent the most intense single-episode expression of that sustained baseline. The most members demanding removal in the shortest time period in the entire documented history of that baseline. This eruption was produced without leadership coordination, from the bottom up, in response to a single presidential statement that required no investigation to establish what it said. The civilization post was there for everyone to read. No filtering through media reports, no interpretation needed. Just the President of the United States threatening to eradicate an entire civilization in plain English. The question now is whether the intensity of the April 7th episode, combined with the accumulated weight of the baseline and the 2026 midterm results, eventually produces the political conditions that convert the sustained conviction into the institutional arithmetic it requires. The documented trajectory has been building. The over 200-member baseline is the documented evidence that the conviction is sustained and not episodic. The 85-plus April 7th count is the documented evidence that it reached its highest single-episode intensity in response to the civilization post. And the 2026 midterms are the specific political event that will determine whether the intensity and the sustained baseline together produce the changed arithmetic that the conviction has been building toward across the full arc of the documented trajectory. The gap between the midnight urgency rhetoric and the constitutional mechanics deserves careful examination because it reveals the specific tragedy of the moment, the constitutional trap that the founders could never have anticipated. The civilization post went up in the early morning hours. The deadline Trump had set for Iran was approaching. The military threat was live. And the demands for removal before midnight were made in the period between the post and the ceasefire. In the specific window when the deadline was still active, the military threat was still live. And the constitutional mechanisms that could stop it were not available on the timeline the urgency demanded. The Section 4 mechanism can operate on a midnight timeline, but only if Vance and the cabinet act. Vance was not going to act, the cabinet was not going to act, and the impeachment mechanism requires a legislative process that takes weeks at minimum, a timeline the before midnight framing explicitly rejects as inadequate to the urgency. The gap between the urgency the before midnight language expresses and the institutional availability of the mechanisms it is demanding is the specific constitutional predicament that Murphy and Khanna and Markey and Moulton and Pelosi were all articulating from different angles. The most urgent crisis of the second term produces the clearest available case for immediate removal through the fastest available constitutional mechanism. And the fastest available constitutional mechanism requires the institutional willingness of Vance and the cabinet, a willingness that is simply not available in the current political configuration. The demand for removal before midnight is the constitutional expression of a crisis that has no constitutional solution, a president who may be unfit to serve, a mechanism that could remove him immediately, and the people who control that mechanism who will not act. This is the constitutional nightmare that the April 7th demands exposed, a system designed to handle presidential incapacity that becomes incapable of functioning when the people closest to the president are politically unwilling to acknowledge his incapacity. Now let's talk about what the post-ceasefire demand persistence means, because this is where the constitutional argument gets genuinely powerful, and where the strategic logic of the removal demands becomes clearest. When Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and others insisted that the ceasefire changes nothing, they were making the specific constitutional argument that most directly addresses the gap between the midnight urgency and the continuing removal case. The ceasefire resolves the immediate military crisis, the specific 90 minutes before deadline resolution that Pakistan brokered and that stopped the countdown to the expiration of the civilization deadline. But it does not undo the civilization post. It does not undo the unauthorized Iran war that the ceasefire temporarily paused. It does not undo the 4 hours claim about Iran's entire infrastructure that retired Admiral Smith described as likely a war crime. The members who maintain removal demands after the ceasefire was announced were making the specific constitutional argument that the offense was committed before the ceasefire and is not erased by it. That the standard for removal is the conduct that produced the demand, not the resolution of the specific crisis that produced the conduct. This is the conduct not consequences constitutional framework that has been the defining position of the pro-removal bloc in every episode where a subsequent resolution of the precipitating crisis could otherwise diffuse the demand. The before midnight urgency was about the specific moment before the ceasefire when the civilization deadline was active, the military threat was live, and the Section 4 mechanism was the only constitutional removal tool compatible with the timeline. The post-ceasefire persistence is about the conduct that produced the threat and the constitutional argument that the conduct, not its resolution, is what the removal mechanisms are designed to address. This framework removes every future ceasefire, every future crisis resolution, every future de-escalation from its capacity to function as a political escape valve for the removal demands. If the conduct is the offense, the resolution of the crisis the conduct produced does not resolve the accountability question. The constitutional significance of this framework can't be overstated because it fundamentally changes the political dynamics of every future crisis. Previous crises could be defused by resolving the immediate threat, the ceasefire that stops the shooting, the agreement that calms the tensions, the diplomatic resolution that allows everyone to declare victory and move on. But if the conduct itself is the offense, if the threat to eradicate an entire civilization is itself the grounds for removal, regardless of whether the threat was actually carried out, then no resolution of any future crisis can function as a reset of the accountability demands that the conduct produced. The members who said the ceasefire changes nothing on April 7th are establishing a constitutional precedent that will apply to every future crisis, every future presidential statement that crosses the line from policy disagreement to fundamental unfitness. Watch whether the conduct not consequences framework holds as the defining constitutional position of the pro-removal bloc in every future escalation and resolution cycle. Whether the members who said the ceasefire changes nothing maintain that position when the next crisis produces the next ceasefire and the next opportunity to diffuse removal demands by pointing to the resolution of the specific crisis that produced them. Because the conduct not consequences framework is a specific constitutional argument that makes the before midnight urgency and post-ceasefire persistence coherent as a single constitutional position rather than as conflicting responses to the same event. The urgency is about the timeline of the threat. The persistence is about the conduct that produced the threat, and together they form a comprehensive constitutional argument that no crisis resolution can erase the evidence of presidential unfitness that the crisis itself revealed. This is the framework that makes every future resolution of every future crisis incapable of functioning as a reset of the accountability demands that the conduct established, because the conduct is the offense, not the crisis it produced. And the offense remains regardless of whether the crisis was resolved. Let me bring this all together with the clean constitutional logic that emerges from the April 7th demands, because the coherence of the strategy becomes clear when you understand the distinct arguments each member was making and how they complement each other. Murphy's "no president in control of his senses" formulation is the Section 4 unfitness standard stated as common sense, an appeal to Vance and the cabinet that requires no expert evaluation to recognize. Khanna's "we invoke the 25th and remove" is the most procedurally direct removal demand of the second term, naming the specific mechanism and the specific action it requires without the procedural intermediation of the legislative process. Moulton's "committed an impeachable offense, oust him before he inflicts further harm" is the constitutional bridge between the backward-looking accountability track and the forward-looking urgency track, deploying both mechanisms simultaneously to create maximum constitutional pressure. And the post-ceasefire persistence of Ocasio-Cortez and others is the constitutional assertion that conduct, not consequences, is what the removal mechanisms are designed to address, a framework that removes every future resolution from its capacity to function as an escape valve for accountability demands. The April 7th demands, invoking the 25th Amendment, impeachment, and every available mechanism, failed to remove Trump but created a permanent constitutional record of congressional judgment about his unfitness. The ceasefire didn't erase the conduct. Over 85 members documented that the president was unfit to serve, and that record now survives for future Congresses to examine, regardless of when the political conditions finally shift.